Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Wild Goose, how are we this morning? Woo! Yes, and that's for all of you who are trying to sleep in. Yes, we are waking you up this morning. So this morning we're going to continue with our conversation about what it means to live liberation with our three theologians. Our featured theologian this morning is Joerg Rieger. And Joerg Rieger comes from SMU's Perkins School of Theology in Dallas, Texas. And I want to give honor to the family that endowed his chair. It's the Windland Cook Professor of Constructive Theology is the name of his chair. And so he's doing very important progressive work in the heartland of the country, in a place where conservatism may be valued, traditional conservatism may be valued a little bit more than the kind of work he's doing, as he's asking the questions of how does class join in this intersectional conversation regarding liberation in the world. And so I want to point out a few of his books so you don't overlook them. And he's offering a discount over in the book tent. Hint, hint, clue, clue, right? Let's support our authors over in the book tent. But one of his books, one of his most recent books is Occupy Religion, which he wrote in conjunction with a wonderful professor out of Boston who's doing post-colonial theology, Kwok Pui-Long, out of Boston. And then another book I want to mention of his is Religion, Theology and Class, Fresh Engagements After Long Silence. Because, you know, we do theology and look at through and analyze through a racial lens and analyze through a post-colonial lens, but sometimes we neglect to bring class and politics into the discussion. And so Yorg edited that and brought together some important authors to talk about that, to talk about power and our approaches to religion and power. And then lastly, his book, No Rising Tide, Theology, Economics, and the Future. Talking about the future of faith and how do we offer a more holistic vision of what it means to be the kingdom of God in the world and invite people into that. Because if we can give that compelling picture, then people have a reason to care about this faith that matters to us. So without further ado, I would like to invite our featured theologian this morning, after which he will enter into conversation again with one of his colleagues, Joerg Rieger. Give him a hand, please.
Well, good morning, Wild Goose.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
All right, good. Just realized I need to fetch my reading glasses because I'm getting at a certain age where I couldn't read my manuscript, otherwise it'd be right there. I'm usually not a great friend of manuscripts, but since time is short, sometimes some notes help so you don't go on rambling forever. I want to talk about this beloved community in what kind of economics, politics, and religion makes it possible. Maybe just one more quick word about myself. I'm obviously an academic. I spent 20 years in Dallas doing this work there. But I'm also involved with activist projects, in my case, mostly religion and labor. In Dallas, that's Jobs with Justice, but also the unions. And just to give you a bit of a background, as an academic, I'm really trying to transform and reshape the academy. As an activist, of course, we're trying to reshape and transform the world. And let's not forget the church as well. We have to reshape and transform the church also, as you know. When we talk about religion in this part of the world, for sure, we first of all have to acknowledge that it's basically what people know, what people see, a conservative phenomenon. I came here from Dallas on my motorcycle. This is part of my spiritual formation. It clears my mind sometimes traveling this way. And what you realize riding a bike through the South is not only multitudes of churches, but really multitude of billboards and messages. Just as I left Texas, there was a dump truck ahead of me that had a sign on the back, Jesus saves, we might wreck the world. Or the other way around, we might wreck the world, no problem, Jesus saves. This is one part of Christianity that doesn't pay attention. Or another billboard said something like, Jesus came to save the world, not the earth. Right? This is the same mentality. Whatever happens here on earth doesn't matter. I stopped on some of the streets in a little city in Alabama, sat down, had an apple, and a young guy comes by and he talks to me about the bike, as a lot of people do, and then he leaves and he turns around and says, I forgot to ask one question, sir. Have you made a personal decision for Jesus Christ? And I looked him deep in the eye and said, yes, I have. And that's exactly how I feel. Yes, I have made my personal decision for Jesus Christ way back. Grew up as a German Methodist, as a teenager, in a tent, mission. Some of you may have remembered these things. And so I'm very sincere about that. Since I had to travel on, I didn't say much more, but this morning I think we have to keep in mind it's not just about making a personal decision for Jesus Christ. It's also about making a political decision for Jesus Christ. It's about making an economic decision for Jesus Christ. So in that sense, the personal decision sometimes is a little too easy, a little too harmless. All you do is sign a little card and say, I'm a member of the club now. On the other hand, these other decisions is what really get us going and what might make a difference in this world. So in this context of conservative religion, could tell you a few stories from Dallas, Texas there as well. The good news is that religion also has another face. That's what I want to talk about this morning. Not complaining about what we all know, but really saying, what are these alternatives? What is the progressive face of religion? Now, today, since progressive religion has been suppressed so much, people might get the impression this is all about us reinventing progressive Christianity or us inventing progressive Christianity. Let me tell you, in this country, progressive Christianity has been with us from the very beginning. This is not a new thing. This is something that was with us every step of the way. And whenever you had a progressive social movement, keep in mind, in the United States, history is changed through progressive social movements. Not so much through great presidents or politicians or anything else. It's the social movements. And whenever you had a great social movement, you also had progressive religion there. Think back to slavery times. There were the abolitionists, people that were working against slavery, not just because they thought it was wrong, but because they understood that religion was against slavery. Their faith was against slavery. Their God was against slavery. And then let's never forget the slaves themselves that developed their own theologies. These are genuine progressive theologies of the people that are part and parcel of our heritage. So whenever you sing the gospel hymns, the blues, the spirituals, those are part of our native progressive traditions in this country. We could go on and on, but there was a progressive component in every of these movements, including the suffragist movement. Some of these women, of course, got huge pushback from religion and the churches, especially the male pastors. But they also reread their religious traditions, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and the Women's Bible, Sojourner Truth. Here you have a lot of progressive traditions that we're sometimes overlooking these days as progressives. The civil rights movement, of course, everybody remembers that to some degree, so I don't need to mention it specifically. But let me also mention the religion and labor movement. This goes back over 100 years. And there was a time when even the mainline churches, like my own United Methodist Church, had a progressive view on Christianity, a progressive view on the world, a progressive view on politics. So they were actually siding with the people, with the workers, arguing for Not only the Social Creed in 1908 not only argued for the 8-hour workday, but for the reduction of working hours to the lowest amount possible. Can you imagine that? So we're going further. It's not just 8 hours. We're having some hope that life could actually be more than just work and toil. My own academic work, of course, received important impulses from all of these movements. And that's what kept me going for these 20 years in the South. I often tell my students in Dallas, if we can do it here, we can do it anywhere. So if we can do it, there's hope for you guys as well. And I think that's the good news of the gospel. Let me say a few things about religion and power, because this is part of our problem. Conservative religion, as you all know, has made this alliance with the powers that be. It's quite obvious, and in some ways it has been very detrimental. We're at a situation in this country where we have a divide not only of wealth, but also of power that may be unprecedented in history. Listen to these numbers. This is fascinating. In the United States today, the 1% owns 40% of all wealth. That's a gap of wealth, but it's also a gap of power. The 1% owns 40% of all wealth. Now, compare the Roman Empire to this. This is the crazy thing. In the Roman Empire, the 1% owned 16% of all wealth. So the Roman Empire was more egalitarian than the United States today. Can you imagine that? 1 to 40, 1% owns 40%. Today, Roman Empire, 1% owns 16%. I'm a theologian, so for me, the real question in relation to these observations is, what about God? And the problem that we're facing is that this power that we have shaped up shapes not only our politics, our economics, our lives, it also shapes our images of God. There's the problem. So we think of God more and more like those at the top. Well, perhaps we've always done that to some degree. But today, in the old days, God was envisioned as a powerful monarch. Today, God is perhaps envisioned as a powerful CEO. Or perhaps, a CEO-type pastor, or somebody who has a great deal of power. And so the problem here with this power is not only a political one, it's a very deeply religious one. And what we're facing is a struggle between certain images of God, dominant images of God, and alternative images of God that are bubbling up from the grassroots. These images of God are also part of our tradition, but we now today have to reclaim them. And you cannot have it both ways. You cannot have the top-down image together with the bottom-up image. Once you embrace the bottom-up image, you may have to reject the top-down image. In the Roman Empire, there was a sense that the Christians were atheists. This is very strange, right? This was a religious community, the Christians following the Messiah, Jesus Christ. But the Romans saw them as atheists. And I think the Romans were exactly right. Because these early Christians rejected Roman-type theism. That's your problem. Roman-type theism is what they were opposed to. What was that like? Well, it was a top-down God at the top, like the emperor, impassible, immutable, omnipotent, able to do anything he wanted, commanding, but never being there, not sitting with the people. That was the God that these early Christians indeed rejected. Now, they reclaimed a different God, so they didn't stay without a God, but their God was not like the Roman God. So their atheism became another life religion that made a difference not only in their thinking, but in their living and in the world as a whole. That's the exciting story about early Christianity. Fast forward to today, what you're getting is perhaps a sense that what we're talking about now is not so much the opposition of religion and atheism, but we're talking about the opposition of a certain form of dominant religion and an alternative form of religion. And in this process, some of the atheists are actually our allies, because they too reject this top-down image of God that they can no longer embrace. They too raise the sort of questions that these early Christians raised about an omnipotent God who is not there, who does not sit, who does not walk with the people. So this is the story that we are pursuing. This is part of our heritage. That reshuffles, of course, the way we look at the world, the way we look at our neighbors. It even reshuffles interreligious dialogue. Because the point here is now no longer religion, yes or no. The real question is, what kind of religion? What are these alternatives? And the good news that I'm here to tell to you is that we already have these alternatives in place. They're part of our history. What we need to do more sincerely, in a more organized fashion, is reclaim them. That's our task. So we don't have to invent anything. We simply have to reclaim it, and we have to do it together. Individuals, one or the other, that doesn't really help us. In our religious traditions, if I had more time this morning, I'd talk more extensively about our Jewish background. Now keep in mind the Abrahamic traditions include not only Judaism and Christianity, but also Islam. Even in these three traditions, for instance, have in common the Exodus. There you have an image of God where God walks with oppressed people for liberation. And if you walk for, you also walk against. That's, of course, the tough thing. We don't want to face that usually. But you walk for the people, you're also walking against the empire. You're walking against the Pharaoh. And these traditions already give you an image of the deep roots of our alternative religious traditions. The Jesus story, of course, for us is better known, but we oftentimes don't take it at its full force. Jesus, as you know, did not side with the elites either, but he sided with what has been called the multitude. By the way, Melvin gave you the title of one of my recent books, Occupy Religion. He didn't mention the subtitle, which is Theology of the Multitude. This is where we find Jesus together, organizing, joining in solidarity with the multitude. And the power that emerges there is a different one. It's not hierarchical, it's not top-down, it's not elitist. It's people power, it's bottom-up power, it's power that gets organized. If you want to make some distinctions, you'd have to say this is not even what we call democracy. When we say democracy, the Greek roots of that go back, of course, to ancient Greek. The idea is it's still an elitist system. In ancient Greece itself, the people who were ruling in a democracy were the elites. Not everybody could be elected to office. Not everybody was doing the voting. Yep. What me and some of my colleagues have worked out here is alternative terms that come directly from the Bible. One of them is what we're calling laocracy. The Greek term laos, the people. Now that talks about the rule of the people. The demos are the elite citizens, the laos are the common people. This is right there in the New Testament. I find some real great support from some of my Latin American colleagues like Nestor Miguez in Argentina, Jung Mo Sung in Brazil. A few years ago we wrote a book together, Beyond the Spirit of Empire, where we worked this out, this whole idea of laocracy as the power of the common people, where solidarity and cooperation is more important than competition and one-upmanship. Another term that also comes from the Greek New Testament that we find useful is ochlocracy. The oklos is another Greek word. This is now the mass of the people. Sometimes gets translated as the mob. I don't think that's a great translation. It's talking about the masses. And when you talk about ochlocracy, you're talking about the rule of the common people, the rule of the masses. This is a term that comes to us from Korean theology, Minjung theology of the 1970s. Another people's theology that was out there especially with people in the field, people struggling for survival against oppression. The Koreans talked about Minjung was their word for the multitude. So there are many alternative visions, and I'm always looking at the clock here because we have so little time. Let me just leave you with that. In terms of our traditions, this is something that we have to keep in the back of our minds. And then you're talking about the people, not just as individual little people all over the world. You're now beginning to think about movements. That's one of the recent insights about Jesus, that what made him so dangerous to the Roman Empire was not just that he was a radical preacher, but that he was actually an organizer. He was a preacher and an organizer together. And this is an amazing image, thinking about Jesus not just as having some great wisdom, but also at organizing this alternative bottom-up power. So once you see the problem with the top-down power of the empire, once you see what's wrong with conservative religion, you don't have to divest yourself of power, you don't have to give it all up. You simply have to reclaim a different sort of power. That's what we're talking about, this bottom-up power that makes all the difference in the world. So this is how it might happen, that the last will be the first and the first will be the last. What comes together here is what was organically connected for ancient people all over the world. Religion, politics, economics, culture, personal life, family, community. Those things we are separating today, we think they are all different categories. The reality is, for people like Jesus, Paul, the early Christians, and many indigenous traditions, these are all connected. I want to conclude by introducing a term that hopefully we can explore a bit in the conversation. And this is what I'm calling deep solidarity. Some of you may remember the old days where we oftentimes considered solidarity as privileged people putting themselves on the side of underprivileged people. Those of us with privilege helping those without privilege. Deep solidarity is a way of talking about the fact that we may be all in the same boat. As the Occupy movement has said, there's a difference between the 99% and the 1%. One way to define it is to say that the 1% are the ones that don't have to work for a living. So if you have to work for a living, even if you're a business person, even if you're middle class, you may really be much more part of the 99% than you ever realized. And deep solidarity acknowledges that. So here we're not coming from a position of privilege. Here we're coming from a position of solidarity that ties us all together in a way that is new. Now, what is important about deep solidarity is not that we're now all alike, but once we see this commonality that we're all in the same boat, we're also beginning to see how valuable our differences are. So deep solidarity is a way of really appreciating and putting to work our differences. Usually our differences are used to divide us, play us off against each other. Now we may have a way of actually using these differences constructively in the resistance. So we'll talk more about that, I'm sure. I'll stop the talk here, and I'm really enjoying my time at the Wild Goose, so sun is coming out, a great day.
Thank you so much, Yorg. And now we are going to invite Ruth Padilla DeBorst to come back to the stage and to enter into conversation with Yorg. You may remember that the work she's doing now, that really is her passion, is with the International Fellowship for Mission as Transformation. And she's working both in the U.S. and abroad, in where she now makes her home, Costa Rica, and all throughout Latin America. So thank you so much for joining us again, Ruth, and you two take it away.
Good morning, good morning. Buenos dias. And for those of you who were here yesterday, let's think if it really is buenos dias, right? But I think Yorg, you did help us see why we could say buenos dias today, in spite of the stories we shared yesterday. And I guess one of my questions, just to hear you develop this a little more, would be, you gave us some of these historical alternatives that are part of this tradition. You mentioned the Jewish, you mentioned the Jesus movement. What would you say could be sources today of this alternative perspective about the use of power?
Well, let me talk about a very practical thing that we're doing in Dallas these days. I mentioned working with justice earlier, and there's a campaign organizing Walmart. Now, you have to understand, in the United States, it's mostly not possible for most workers to even organize a union. But the Walmart workers are getting together. They're forming a community, kind of not yet a union, but realizing what they have in common. That's called Our Walmart, OUR, Organization United for Respect, Walmart. And what we've done in Dallas for about 2 years now is we've been reading the Bible with these Walmart workers. And in Dallas, most of the workers that we're working with are racial minorities, many African Americans, women. And from reading the Bible, oftentimes with these workers on the ground, in the midst of the struggle, this is bringing everything together, right? It's not just talking about personal issues, it's talking about politics, it's talking about struggles, talking about liberation. We're really gaining a sort of energy that is just amazing, that you couldn't gain from anything else. This is what even some of our secular union organizer friends, my wife, one of them, are realizing that there is a power in religion that is genuine. This is not just us make-believe, doing things in order to be successful, but to work together. And what's happening, this is the exciting thing, it's we're reading the Bible with these workers, the workers get empowered, but those of us who read with them also get empowered and transformed. So some of the professors, we have some pastors, we have an evangelical big steeple pastor with us who is reading the Bible with the workers. We have church people with us. We have some of my students with us, and we're all transformed together, and it's happening right here and right now.
Reminds me of a fantastic book by Bob Ekblad, Reading the Bible with the Damned. And it makes me just think, okay, so how then, so sociologists and sociologists of religion and such in, say, 40 years ago, diagnosed that the world was going secular, right? I mean, you have Peter Berger saying the world it's the sacred canopy, and we're just going to find our way outside of that and define everything in a secular way. What would you comment about the switch that even Peter himself, in looking at the world, has realized? Where is religion that really is empowering, as you mentioned?
This is a very strange phenomenon, and we're usually not getting a good handle of it because we're not thinking in terms of power, and that includes the class issue. So I'm from Germany. You guessed my accent wasn't from Texas, right? And their secularization is very real. I come from a small town of 15,000 people, and if you're very lucky, you'll find about 100 people in church, in various churches on Sunday morning. So it's happening there. There's also secularization that happens, to some people that have some privilege and have some status. But there's a religion of the people that cannot be rooted out that easily. And this is what the struggle is all about. So the religious right knows this too, and they're fighting exactly for the heart of the common people. That includes a lot of lower class white men as well, and they're very successful about it. But the truth is, there is another alternative, and there's another alternative religion that we have to embrace and that we have to strengthen. So it's not just religion in general. My business is religion. I hate to talk about religion as such. What we really have to look at is what kinds of religions are alive, what kinds of religions are doing what, and then to put our weight as Christians, as people of faith, behind those kinds of traditions that are actually life-giving, liberating, and that make a difference.
So you mentioned Miguel Bonino, Argentina, and of course, those of you who were here yesterday, you know who I'm rooting for tomorrow in the football game. But my question would be, how in this finding alternative views of God, images of God, and perspectives of religion as life-giving rather than just reinforcing the status quo of the difference in power and class and such. What could you comment about sources? You mentioned Mingjung theology, you mentioned Miguel Bonino. Tell us a little more about sources outside of the matrix that we are often bound to within our particular context.
Thanks for that question. This is really crucial. Let me make a brief comment about liberation theology. In some ways, this is my tradition as well. I don't put it on the top of my books necessarily, but if someone calls me a liberation theologian, I do not deny it. And keep in mind, we're not repeating what they were saying 30, 40 years ago. This is not just remouthing what Miguel Bonino, Gustavo Gutierrez, and those people said. The Migues I mentioned was actually Nestor Migues, the son.
Yes.
And so this is a next generation.
Yes.
But what is important here with liberation theology is to realize that these traditions are multitude traditions. So it's not just somebody invented it once at a desk, but they have a history. What is not known at all is that there are 3, 4, 5 different traditions that all came up with the notion liberation independently of each other. The Latin Americans, we know that story. They had their notion. The other story that you probably heard is the African Americans in the United States. So James Cone wrote his book, Liberation Theology, the 1970s, without knowing about the Latin Americans. So he came up with this term, not copying Gustavo Gutierrez, but he came up with it on his own. There's somebody that probably very few people remember, if any. This was one of my teachers at Duke University, Frederick Herzog, who was a white male, also of Germanic background at some point, who also wrote an article titled Liberation Theology, published a few months before Cone published his book. Not knowing of Cone, knowing Cone, but not knowing that Cone was coming out with this project, not knowing of Gutierrez in his term. So you have already 3 different beginnings where people are using the word independently of each other. And the reason they're doing it is not because they're such great thinkers, but because this is what's coming to them from the people's traditions. Liberation theologies are always people's theologies, and all we can do as theologians is formulate them, put them, in ways that introduce other traditions. But we're not the creators of it. So it's the people themselves. And then if you go back in history, this is the great news, we're now reclaiming thousands of years of people's liberation theologies that we hadn't even known existed.
So one of the other points, thanks, that was great just to get that perspective. One of the other points you mentioned was how faith, religion of the people can actually put together some of these things that have been pulled apart. I'm struck by it. It reminded me of Andrew Walls, this historian, saying there's a reality in which our world, the rest of the world that's not embedded with power, tends to have more direct access to Scripture because their stories are they're a little closer than those of the societies where power and religion have been wedded so powerfully. Could you just comment a little more on that?
This is really huge. Our problem with the Bible is not that it's not clear. Our problem is that we have created all these lenses, all these layers of obscuring what the Bible really says. And so, if you hear a statement like Jesus is Lord, you think this is about going to heaven or something like that. While in reality, for the early Christians, it was Jesus as being a Lord in a very different fashion than the Roman Emperor. Now, what you're saying, I think, is really crucial. There are some people among us who have better access to that, who have not been quite as distorted as some of us. And, I'm one of those who's really had to cut through a lot of these distortions myself, because that's not necessarily the way I was raised. But as the common people read these things, as you read the Bible out there with the people in the stores, in the shops, in the struggle. Fred Herzog used to talk about the Bible in hand method, which is something he says he learned from sharecroppers in North Carolina, in the fields, eastern North Carolina. People reading the Bible, and in a way that he, the great theologian, had to learn from the people. This is exactly what's happening to me. A lot of stuff I'm learning from the people. This is true too for the historical Jesus research. The reason why we're not making as much progress as we could is that we're still using some of our own paradigms. So you get Jesus as a wisdom preacher, you get Jesus as a great prophet and all that. A lot of that is still some of the privileged paradigms where we, the elite, have to put ourselves in solidarity with the poor. It's not deep solidarity, it's not organizing, but if we saw that, I think we really had a different approach. And the people, I see this with my Walmart workers every day, they're getting it.
So, you're talking about this deep solidarity, and I think the reality here is most of our brothers and sisters sitting here are actually in positions of privilege. Being able to take time out to come camp and hang around and buy food and such, that's quite a privilege. And typically then I think, as I've observed, privilege then sometimes comes guilt, comes even paralysis. Like, I mean, I know this now, I know too much, I know I'm wealthy, I know I'm privileged, I know I'm part of this close to the 1%, but what do I do? Stuff is so complicated, the world is such a mess, so what now? What would your word be?
Excellent, yeah. So this is back to this idea of deep solidarity. Think about your own privilege for a minute. It may be you're making $100,000 a year. That allows you to live comfortably, that allows you to come out here. Maybe you don't even have to stay in a tent, you can rent a cabin. That's all great. But if you think about, it's great, right? Yes, I know. But if you think about the difference between somebody making 100,000 and somebody making 20,000, that's still smaller than somebody making 250,000 or 500,000 or $1 million. So in that sense, we need to be aware of our privilege, but the mistake that we're often making as middle-class people is we think we are the privileged, while in reality there's a whole world that eludes us, that wouldn't have to meet out here in a campground, that would simply rent a convention center, all expenses paid, with a spa next to it. So here, I'm not apologizing for privilege. What I'm saying is you still have to see the difference between the 99% and the 1%, and to understand where you are. If you're white and male, you have some privilege, white privilege, male privilege, clearly. But usually that too is limited. The privilege ultimately funnels up. Your male privilege may not help you, but it helps your boss. Your white privilege may help you less than you think, but it sure helps the white corporations, because they can then play off white workers, black workers, and brown workers against each other. So, having said that, I want to get to your question. What about us here who are middle class? Seeing that sort of, now you think I was talking about money, I'm really talking about power. Your own power is also fairly limited. You think you can save the world? Let me bring it to you. You cannot, certainly not as individuals. Meaning well does not help anything. What helps is organizing. What helps is putting your privilege to use. And now that's not just organizing amongst yourself. This is now organizing with working people. This is organizing with field workers. This is organizing with women. This is organizing with immigrants. I was riding through the fields of North Carolina on the bike, and I saw these immigrants working in the fields, and I thought, those folks are not here to celebrate diversity. They're not here to celebrate diversity. They are here to make a living for justice. And if we get that as people of some privilege, I think that's where we can put our weight together behind them. And then, it's not about feeling guilty anymore. You own up to your privilege, you stand to it, you stare it in the face, and you turn it around. Use it for working with the field workers, for working with those who are oppressed, working for their liberation. You still have to be aware of sin and oppression and your part in it. But start thinking about becoming part of the solution.
So, developing a little further this issue of deep solidarity. And the reality that some of the stories we shared yesterday. Carlos, actually, I will tell just a very brief one. I was in San Salvador, sitting down to talk with a guy that was coming out of the gangs. Tattoos, I mean, nobody here has the tattoos this guy had. All the way up his arms, all the way through over his head and neck. Just incredibly intricate tattoos. I walk up to him, I'm in San Salvador. I speak to him in Spanish. He says, you know English, right? Yes. Could we please speak in English? And I was kind of surprised. And then he tells me, I grew up on peanut butter and jelly. He had grown up in this country, brought at age 4, grew up in LA, did not use any Spanish, got picked up in the street because there had been some car theft or something, had no documents, got put on a plane, sent to San Salvador, had nobody to go to except the gangs who wait for people at the airport to induce them into their gangs to thicken their lines and be stronger. What do we do? What are the issues underlying the reality of these deportations, the reality of him being sent as a kid, the reality of this relationship between powerful and less powerful nations and peoples? Give me a little more concreteness.
So here is where I think we're usually hitting a roadblock. Because we can talk about solidarity, we might even tolerate talking about deep solidarity, but when we're talking about the problems that we're up against, I think that's when it becomes really difficult. So what are we facing? And in this country, and this is not just the United States, this is a globalizing economy, we now have to talk about how money flows, capitalism, who has to support, who doesn't have to support. I'm not talking about the redistribution of wealth here. I'm talking about the value of production. And that means, how do we value labor? How do we value people who work? How do we value somebody like Carlos, who is looking for work, who is trying to work? And the way you build him up, and the way you build up the kids in the gangs, the way you build up a lot of people around us, is really by valuing their creative, their productive capacity. So it's not only necessary for us to talk about redistribution of wealth all the time. Let's talk about the fact that there's so many people, the Latin Americans talked about the excluded for about 15, 20 years now. So many people are simply excluded from this economy. We don't care about them anymore. And I'm not talking about reintegrating them into this economy, but bringing them into a constructive way of being workers, of making a contribution to the world. One thing we're seeing is worker-owned corporations. Mm-hmm. So here's a practical thing. If you want to help Carlos, and you have some privilege, maybe you start a little business that employs some people, that actually gets them to help to bring their life back together. You know, a lot of that may not sound what we do as traditional Christians, but I think it's really necessary, because welfare in this case, or social services, they will help them for a bit. You know the old image about if you give people a fish, you feed them for a day, if you teach them how to fish, then they will feed for the rest of their lives. The problem with that story is that Carlos knows how to fish. He's not stupid. You don't have to teach Carlos how to fish.
Fishing all his life.
You have to remove the fence that someone built around the pond. You have to take a look at the fleet that fished his oceans empty. You know, this is what we have to struggle with.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
Thank you so much, Ruth and Yorg. I so appreciate you working to make the gospel concrete. tearing down this wall between that which is religious and spiritual and about the afterlife and that which is about the now. If the good news isn't good news in the now for the people who need it, the people who need to eat, because they made it here to the Wild Goose, but they didn't have enough to do food, get their food. If the good news isn't good news now, then it's of no particular use. So now it's time for you to engage the people on stage, both Ruth and Yorg. If you have questions, I'd love for you to come to the mic, or I'll bring the mic to you.
Okay, this is going to be really embarrassing because I'm going to be putting myself in a place that may make me look like I'm not an ally, but I really am. I just have a really deep question that I don't hear engaged, and I really need to know the answer. Can you have a country without border controls? And if you have border controls, then if people come in over the line, what do you do? And what do you do about the moral hazard? I got to solve that in my head before I can know where to go.
It's a fair question. Now, keep in mind, I'm an immigrant myself. I grew up in Germany. I went to seminary in Germany. I came to the United States at one point, and I became a citizen. So, yes, there is border control, but the reality is some people come in much more easily than others. And so there is a class issue tied to that. It's also more complicated because the people that oftentimes speak against the immigrants are the people that then put them to work for very little money, that actually benefit off of them twice. They benefit politically by making people hate immigrants, and they benefit economically by working the immigrants to death. So this is the more complex issue. You can still talk about we need to have border control. The question is, what kind of border control? The next question is, why is this a problem to begin with? What is it that pushes people across borders? Are they just coming because they like the climate here? Or are they coming because of matters of survival? Now, we are very clear when it comes to politics that we would open our borders to people who are persecuted for political reasons. People who are facing death and torture somewhere else, we're inviting here because we don't want them to die, to get killed. Economics is a lot more like that than we realize. The people that are coming are also facing some of these choices. Are we going to live? Are we going to support our families? And so in that sense, you know, you have to take the issues in this more complex fashion. Now, keep in mind, too, nations are no longer as autonomous as they once were. There's a great American tradition of being suspicious about politics. But what we still have to learn as Americans to be suspicious about large corporations and economics. So big government, but also big business. And that has a lot to do with these borders as well, what's pushing people, pulling people across the borders. So you really have to address this together. I'd be happy to talk to you afterwards if you want to.
And I'd love to add a couple little things on that one. One is one is just the recognition, and this is something I think we need to grapple with as followers of and citizens of another kingdom, of another ruler, other than the rulers of our day. That is, even these modern nation states are a pretty recent construct in global history. There used to be other ways of organizing our lives together than the modern nation state with its borders declared in a certain way. And so when we reimagine the world a la Kingdom of God, I wonder if we don't need to start questioning some of these loyalties and nationalisms. And this I say even though tomorrow I'm putting my Argentina shirt on to root for us in soccer. But it is something I think we need to start grappling with much more deeply and theologically. The other is, what about these corporations, as Yorg was mentioning, that have been granted in many cases a personal status and can move across borders with no accountability. So you have a corporation setting up their tent in San Salvador, charging, actually the government will subsidize electricity, water, everything, just to have them there because they might give a bit of employment to some people. But if somebody else somewhere else offers them better profits, they can pay less to their workers in Bangladesh, they're gone tomorrow. And those 300 people that thought they had a job no longer do. So what about those border crossings? So I think we need to sometimes think outside of just the very confines of our nation state and look at the world as it is and what are the causes behind why people are coming or moving or needing to get work in this country. So issues just to kind of spark a deeper conversation.
Yorg and Ruth, thank you. I've got a question for you about liberation, theology, power. It seems to me that liberation looks differently for the poor and marginalized than it does for the privileged. And I was struck by Ruth's comment about how most of us who are here, if we're able to be here, we can own some of our privilege just by the fact that we're able to be here. And I was thinking about Paul's image in Philippians 2, the image of kenosis and the image of self-emptying. And I wondered if you might talk about kenosis as a sort of liberation act for those with privilege. If both of you could speak to that.
Thanks, that's a very helpful question. Now keep in mind one thing. When we say privileged, there are some numbers I saw recently that
4 out of 5 Americans will face unemployment, dependence on welfare, and perhaps poverty in their lives. 4 out of 5 Americans. So among those of you sitting here, the majority are going to experience job loss, dependence on welfare, and poverty. So the kenosis in this sense is being done for us a lot more than we are realizing. If you're a racial and ethnic minority, that number grows to 9 out of 10 minorities will face these things in their lives at some point. So in that sense, think about privilege not as something that's established, and even those who are in the middle realize that our jobs are changing, our benefits are changing, the future of our children is not as secure as we once thought, our own retirements maybe, who knows what's going to happen. So having said that, I really want to say to those of us who feel privileged, don't feel too privileged right away. Unless you're multi-millionaire, you may too experience some of these problems. Now, kenosis is a theological value, so let me talk theology here a bit. It comes from this idea, Paul talks about that in Philippians, the Christ hymn in Philippians 2, where Christ was the one who emptied himself, became a human being, became like us. And that's really a theological value. That's talking about God self, really. Not just Jesus as a guy, but God really becoming part of the common people. So that's how I understand kenosis. Those of us with some privilege are not just making ourselves look small, but joining the common people, using our privileges in turn, as we can. But never with the idea of the upward mobility, but really with the idea of being there, staying there, making a difference there. You're exactly right that liberation looks different for the privileged than for the direly oppressed. Jesus recognized that too, right? He would hug some, he would encourage some, he would heal some, and he would have some harsh words to say to others. This is all part of Jesus' love, though. I mean, we think of love as one size fits all, but the love of Jesus for the privileged sometimes might be, preaching the word hypocrites, brood of vipers, and calling them to repentance in that way. So you're right, but again, in the spirit of deep solidarity, let's remind ourselves that most of us are not really privileged and benefiting from this empire as much as we once thought, and then kenosis almost becomes natural. It's not as hard to let go of your little privilege if you realize that this is something that can very easily, and probably will very easily, be taken from you anyway.
So, and I would piggyback on that and what we talked about before about our allegiances, our belongings, because in some ways, I think there is the reality that there are people out there in the 2/3 world, in the majority world, who are far wealthier than anybody here. So this is not about a country versus another country. Increasing, even though in my youth, when I was out in the street marching against interventions of this nation, in nations in our part of the world, and supporting a military dictatorship that was murdering my friends and such, at that time, to me, it was about the nation. It was the U.S., and I wanted nothing to do with it. And I swore I would never marry an American. And I shared with you yesterday, I've done it twice. Why? Because I had to come to grips with the reality that it's not about some of these constructs that put borders and make it an us and them, a me and the other. Really, this is about a human reality and a plight that we share of the impact of sin and injustice and greed and corruption everywhere, across the board, across the borders. And so in some ways, the call, I believe, in a new belonging, in a new perspective, a new image of God, a renewed image of God, and of the calling we have as God's people in the world, is to transcend some of those little, very small niches that have been built, and actually recognizing ourselves as we are God's people in the world. We are part of God's broader humanity, and called, as our brother invited us, to recognize ourselves as such and engage together. That's why I really appreciate the Yorg's talk about the movement of the people. What was it with the laity? Laocracy.
Yeah.
All of us, the people together. And those of us who do follow Jesus, saying the way of Jesus is one that really can provide light and good news to the broader humanity. And it's not about some of these little tight niches that would separate us.
Our time is spent.
Could I just say one more comment here, Melvin?
Actually, give me 1 second, and then yes,
Okay.
you will. Our time is spent. However, I want to err on the side of generosity. And so we haven't had a question from any of our sisters in the audience. And so if there are any women who have been thinking about raising your hand, now is the time. And then I'm going to ask you two to be as succinct as you can in your answer. Raise your hand, I'm going to come your direction. You can talk now, Yorg.
Maybe one way to exemplify what we're talking about is my own life and career. I grew up in Germany. I had the greatest academic education. I have a physics background. I could have easily gone into a very privileged sort of fields in my area. The reason why I didn't was because I took this seriously, becoming part of the people. And that to me had a lot to do with the authority of the Bible. Why am I doing this? Because I think this is what the Bible is talking about. Why am I doing this? Because I think this is what God is all about. So I'm not the hero here, but it's just an example that it's possible.
Okay, good morning.
Good morning.
Both of you give your lives to public study. Both of you are doing public theology. You're doing work that affects larger communities, right? Other countries. Can you speak to any of the personal practices that you have that sustain your spirit as you pour yourself out, as you pour yourself into your work? What is the rhythm of spiritual formation for you that helps you to sustain a connection to a compassionate God that allows you to pour yourself out and not be empty at the end of the day?
Thank you. Yeah, thanks. That's a really essential question because I think those of us who see a lot, who see the reality, sometimes can be driven to an activism and just out there to the point of just losing perspective, losing ourselves, losing our families in the midst of it. And the call of the gospel, why would Jesus say, my burden is light, follow me also? I mean, the demands but also the rest and the Sabbath, and how do we integrate that in when we see so many things that are so wrong and we just feel so passionately called to engage. I think it's for some people it comes more naturally. For some of us, we need to work at resting and realizing, as Yorg said, we are not going to save the world. And I think God has a way of bringing us through experiences in our own lives that show us how broken we are, how unable to save, how non-Messiah I can be. And sometimes they're tough things. Some of us have had to walk through really difficult things that have just kept us very keenly aware of our weakness and our dependency, and that there only is one Messiah. But then also, I think it's something we work with. My husband and I, we live in community, in an intentional community, where we're kept very real by the issues of daily sharing of life and vision and mission with our companions in Casa Adobe in Costa Rica. And so there we have morning prayers together, but we also have to grapple with who washes the dishes. We have to deal with the very elevated moments of joyful worship together and the reality of somebody didn't take out the trash. So some of this is part of my walk.
The first thing I would say in response to your question, I grew up in a very religious family with a lot of spirituality all around. The first thing that was really essential for me was to liberate myself from some of that. So rather than saying I have to do a lot of spirituality, stepping back and saying, no, it may be okay not to do some of this. Now, having said that, the real thing for me happens really, like Fred Herzog said, the Bible in hand method. Reading, not just taking the book around, but taking what it says around with the people. So when I read the Bible with these Walmart workers, that's when it's really happening. And sometimes not only is nothing happening in church, church is distracting from the real thing. Or like riding the motorcycle through the fields, and you get to talk to a lot of people like that because they realize maybe you're one of them. That is a spiritual practice too, because sometimes you talk to people not about God, but you're still talking about God. So this is spirituality too. We had to face this. We have 19-year-old twin daughters who, the challenge, how do you raise them in the faith so that they don't get, just tired of it or drop out. And for us really, in community, taking them with us, to West Dallas, to the working places. We lived in South Africa for a while, we lived in Moscow, in Europe, all kinds of places, Latin America as well. And to practice, to be there not as a tourist, but to be there with the people and realizing how God is walking there. So it's all about, as Fred Herzog said, I never quote him this much anymore. He passed away in 1995. As Herzog says, the real theological question is, what is Jesus doing now? It's not what would Jesus do, but what is Jesus doing now? And your spiritual practice is figuring that out with anything and everything you can.
Please join me in thanking Joerg Rieger and Ruth Padilla DeBorst for being with us this morning and helping us expand our horizons around the question of what it means to live liberation. Now we will move on, but one of the practices Vincent Harding used to talk about is a movement needs music, right? And so we're going to come back together about 11:15 and sing some freedom songs and